In reflecting on 50 years of land-based efforts as an arboretum,
we offer a land acknowledgement as a step toward understanding and reconciling the past and moving forward toward a shared future.
The land where the Arboretum now grows has been home to plants and wildlife for thousands of years.
It was home to indigenous people before settlers arrived.
We recognize the Between the Lakes Treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, on which the University of Guelph and the Arboretum now sit.
We recognize the spirit of the dish with one spoon covenant and the teaching it represents.
That there is one earth we all must equitably share and protect.
As an arboretum, this land now supports native trees, as well as trees carried here by recent visitors and planted through conservation efforts and seed exchanges.
Recognizing the living history of this place and our relations in it is one part of our efforts to understand the land, to care for the flora and fauna that call it home,
and to contribute to a positive sense of culture and identity for all people in our communities.
Hello, I'm Rene Acker, Dean of the Ontario Agricultural College here at the University of Guelph. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this virtual event kicking off the golden anniversary of the Arboretum. The effort to create the Arboretum 50 years ago was led by the Ontario Agricultural College, and a planning committee included faculty from across the campus. It was a moment of great change here at the University of Guelph, and the Arboretum was part of the vision for how Guelph would fully become a comprehensive university. The Arboretum quite literally grew over time. Open farm fields, which were former experimental field plots for the OAC, have grown into maturing groves of trees. The boundaries of the Arboretum have expanded to encompass more than 400 acres, much of it reforested with native tree species, producing wildlife corridors and trails that connect to nearby natural areas. The Arboretum has grown to become a vital part of the University of Guelph, as well as the city of Guelph, by fostering a connection to the land and community. Thousands of volunteers have contributed to its mission, led by dedicated staff that regularly go above and beyond in their duties. Research conducted in the Arboretum by Guelph faculty and staff, as well as researchers from across the province, have resulted in more than 100 peer-reviewed publications and many more books, articles, and stories. Students have been an important part of this special place since the beginning. Every semester, students learn from the plant collections, waters, and grounds. They conduct research as part of classes, independent studies, and experiential learning projects. Even now, during the COVID pandemic, with distancing safety protocols in place, and of course, the Arboretum has been a place of respite and contemplation and being for students since it was founded. Indeed, in these challenging times, we've seen the vital importance of the Arboretum. Research on living collections continued, educators and nature interpreters shifted their work online, and our trails were allowed to remain open for walk-through access. Many students, faculty, staff, and community members were able to use the Arboretum grounds as an important place to get outside safely for physical exercise and mental well-being. The Arboretum provides us an inspiring model of environmental sustainability, biodiversity, conservation, and the many benefits of urban green spaces right here on our campus. It provides us with a critical place to achieve our mission to improve life. Thank you for joining us online today and celebrating this wonderful place. I look forward to the talk by our guest speaker, who connects the work of arboreta and botanical gardens like ours to food security, key issues for our unique position as Canada's food university. I look forward to continued opportunities to reflect into next year as we can look back while also looking forward to the future of the Arboretum.
Hello and welcome. I'm Justine Richardson, the director of the University of Guelph Arboretum, and I'm excited to welcome you to our event today as we kick off a year-long series, the Arboretum's Living Laboratory, 50 Years and Growing, which celebrates the Arboretum's history and looks forward to the future. 50 years ago, in 1970, the University of Guelph made the really extraordinary decision to set aside several hundred acres of land right next to campus to create this Arboretum, which is dedicated to furthering the university's mission of research and teaching and community outreach. And now at 50, our Arboretum is more important than ever and is poised to play a role in so many important issues of our day. The Arboretum grounds include world-class plant collections and formal gardens, beautiful meadows teeming with life, especially this time of the fall, an old-growth forest, a provincially protected significant wetland, and living gene banks where threatened and endangered trees produce seed that is contributed to international efforts aimed at conserving biodiversity. Tonight, we're honored to host Dr. Saharah Chapotin, Executive Director of the United States Botanic Garden. Chapotin is a plant scientist with a passion to educate people about the importance of plants and agriculture. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Stanford University and a doctorate in plant physiology from Harvard University. She has worked on food security issues, and she speaks about the unique role that arboreta and botanical gardens have in global plant conservation efforts, such as the preservation of genetic diversity through conservation of wild crop relatives, for example. She's conducted forest ecology and canopy biology research in the United States and Madagascar and Costa Rica, and we're really excited to have her join us and are looking forward to her talk, Local Leadership and Global Impact, Botanic Gardens Advancing Food Security. Welcome, Saharah Moon.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. It's really great to be with you tonight. Congratulations to the University of Guelph Arboretum on reaching 50 years. That's fantastic. Today, I'm going to speak about how gardens and arboreta contribute to food security. I'll provide examples around conservation of crop wild relatives, and I'll share thoughts on urban agriculture and how public gardens can provide local leadership in this space. In today's world, access to healthy, nutritious food is more important than ever. We've seen great gains in productivity, food distribution, and access in past decades. But prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, globally, over 700 million people were still living in poverty, and over 800 million people were undernourished. Children and women are often the hardest hit. Again, pre-pandemic, 159 million children around the world suffered from stunting, which is a metric of chronic long-term malnutrition with lasting physical and cognitive effects. Global population growth will continue through 2050, and it's estimated that food production must increase by 60 to 70% to meet that demand. As I said, that was the situation before the COVID-19 pandemic swept the globe. The full impacts of the pandemic remain to be seen, but a lot of the progress of the past decades could be undone. Millions around the world are likely to slide back into poverty. The World Food Program is predicting an additional 130 million people could face chronic hunger. As incomes drop and safety nets can't keep up, children will be among the hardest hit. Health and nutrition services have stopped altogether during some lockdowns, and the poorest families will face starvation, and many more children will suffer malnutrition. We will emerge from this global pandemic, but the threats of climate change, habitat loss, and declining biodiversity will still be with us. We have to grow more food, and we have to grow more nutritious and diverse foods. The way I see it, there are two ways to go about this. The first is business as usual. We continue to clear land to grow more food. We suffer the environmental consequences of doing so. The climate change, the deforestation, the water quality impacted, the loss of biodiversity, and the increased rural poverty. The second approach focuses on sustainable intensification. It requires both the science to deliver the solutions, but also the inclusive agricultural transformation. Women will have to be fully included. We will increase the productivity of existing land while reducing impact on natural resources. This requires investments in agronomy and plant breeding. Farmers are going to need new, more productive, stress-tolerant, nutritious varieties of existing crops, and also new and different crops. And they'll have to grow them in new rotations with different approaches to crop management, zero-till, intercropping, perennial crops, and agriculture is going to have to mitigate climate change rather than exacerbating it. I believe we can do this. We were doing it in my previous job when I worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development. It was truly amazing to see the transformation of agricultural systems around the world. So where do gardens and arboreta come in? We have a very important role to play. We're often located in large urban centers, and therefore we can have an outsized impact through education and public outreach. Many gardens and arboreta have active research programs. They're often focused more on plant science than on agricultural science, but those are transferable skills. With the right partnerships, we have tremendous resources to address these challenges. Botanic gardens also have significant amounts of germplasm. It's estimated that there are 120,000 plants cultivated in gardens worldwide, as well as extensive seed banks and herbaria. And our collections are hugely important to ex situ conservation. Many gardens also contribute to conservation efforts, including habitat restoration, both locally and around the globe. And finally, we excel at education, and we can pivot these resources to focus on food and agriculture. Breeding approaches are going to be hugely important. Plant breeding is really where the germplasm and the science intersect. To meet food demand in a changing climate, breeders are going to have to focus on the full range of options available to them, from gene editing and other modern technologies to mining genetic diversity, and ultimately broadening the genetic base for both traditional and commercial crops. And crop wild relatives hold many of those important genes and traits. Because we can now access this genetic diversity more easily using these modern approaches, we can tap into a broader range of plants in our breeding work. Breeders are really going to need that genetic diversity to introduce those traits for pest and disease resistance, for stress tolerance, and for nutritional content. Despite this, the germplasm from crop wild relatives can be very hard to access. Crop wild relatives are globally underrepresented in gene banks around the world. A recent study determined that over 70% of crop wild relatives were a priority for collecting in the wild. Notably, the wild relatives of some of our most important food crops were particularly underrepresented. Crops like maize, banana, cassava, sorghum, cowpea, sweet potato, the list goes on. Last year, at a convening in Iowa, we rolled out a new roadmap for the conservation of crop wild relatives, followed by a special issue of Crop Science that you see here on the screen. The roadmap outlined priorities for the conservation of crop wild relatives in North America. The next 5 slides will summarize this roadmap, and I'll give you some examples of where gardens and arboreta can contribute. As a side note, Tara Moreau, who's listed on both as an author on both these papers, is at the University of British Columbia Botanical Garden. She's happy to connect with any of you here in Canada on these topics. So the first area is to understand, document, and assess threats and gaps in conservation of crop wild relatives. Botanic gardens have very relevant expertise on staff. Many of you are engaged in these efforts. Many gardens also have herbaria that have contributed to our understanding of the distribution of crop wild relatives. Expanding collaborations with agricultural researchers could really strengthen this work. For example, it could help to better catalog the distribution of these crop wild relatives. The next step is to conserve crop wild relatives in situ. Some gardens and arboreta also protect and restore natural habitats, like the Guelph Arboretum. A better understanding of where crop wild relatives occur would help to ensure that they are included in those conservation efforts. And then, of course, collecting and conserving crop wild relatives ex situ is important. And this is what gardens and arboreta do all the time with their living collections and seed banks. Many gardens are also supporting in situ conservation of food crops and their wild relatives. So I've noted just a few examples here, but there are many more. And then, of course, making those collections accessible and available to breeders is hugely important. Some gardens actually have breeders on staff, or they've established collaborations with breeders. The Minnesota Landscape Arboretum and the National Tropical Botanic Gardens are 2 good examples. We need to ensure that the crop wild relatives held in the collections are made available to the scientific community and to breeders so that they can actually be used. And then finally, we need to raise public awareness. And many gardens are engaged in food and agriculture programming and education efforts. Crop wild relatives are part of this story. The gardens, you all can raise awareness of their value and their conservation needs. Particularly in urban areas where people aren't very connected to their food or to the value of plant communities, this message is hugely important. So another area where I believe that gardens can really contribute to food security, but at a very local level, is in urban agriculture. In 2018, we, the U.S. Botanic Garden, asked the American Public Gardens Association to do a report on urban agriculture as an instrument of social, economic, and environmental change in America's urban centers. Here in the U.S., over 57% of public gardens are in urban areas. And so gardens, I think, are a natural fit to lead in the space of urban agriculture. This report's available on the website at the link here, but I'll just provide you with a few highlights. Urban agriculture programming is often designed to address many different objectives that you see here. Some programs are trying to reach several of these objectives. This can actually make it really difficult to understand or describe or assess the impact that we're having through these programs. In some cases, you would design a program very differently to meet certain of these objectives than to meet others. So I believe it's very important to be very clear what you're trying to accomplish if you do go down this road. Different program types are going to be more or less successful at meeting these different objectives. This photo here is from the Windy City Harvest. It's a program run by the Chicago Botanic Garden out in the community. It reaches diverse participants from youth to people coming out of the criminal justice system. The study found that there's some real opportunities for botanic gardens to be engaged in urban agriculture. Some of these, like sharing gardening expertise or fostering environmental sustainability, many gardens already are doing. But urban agriculture can also be a way for gardens to enter new areas of engagement, such as health and nutrition. And it can also be a really powerful way to include immigrant and refugee populations in your outreach efforts. Here's a photo from the New York Botanical Gardens Edible Academy. It's an on-site facility. It has outdoor gardens, it has a greenhouse, it has teaching kitchens, and it encourages interest in gardening, nutrition, and environmental stewardship. There are, of course, also a number of barriers to success in this area. Many programs can be described as successful, but the data are often lacking to really assess how those programs are meeting their intended objectives. So if you're going to engage in this space, I would urge you to form those partnerships ahead of time with the impact assessment experts. So before you even start your implementation, you'll really be able to measure your impact, and others can learn from your investments in addition to the impact that you're having. This is a photo from the hydroponics greenhouse at one of the University of the District of Columbia's urban food hubs. So earlier, I described the global impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on food security. In the United States, the pandemic has disproportionately affected low-income households that were already struggling to meet their basic needs. The figures on the slide here are from the United States, though I know that there have been significant impacts on food security in Canada as well. In the US, 1 in 4 households have struggled to get enough food this year. Food insecurity has tripled among households with children. Food banks are serving, on average, 50% more people. This is a photo of lines of cars waiting to enter a food bank in San Antonio, Texas, earlier this summer. And the impacts aren't even. Hispanics, Blacks, women, young workers, immigrants are feeling the impacts more greatly. So we knew that many public gardens are engaged in urban agriculture, and we were seeing how the gardens themselves were being so impacted by the pandemic, and many were having to scale back their programming. So we worried about the impact of that scale back on communities that most needed access to healthy foods and support to grow their own foods, and especially as they were headed into the summer growing season when these activities would normally be started. So we launched the Urban Agriculture Resilience Program this spring in partnership with the American Public Garden Association. And the response to our solicitation was overwhelming. We put out a call for proposals. We got over 70 applications in just 2 weeks. And the total funding requested was about 5 times what we had available initially. We were able to allocate some additional resources and make 28 different awards to public gardens to continue these food growing activities, their education activities. Some gardens even took their existing sort of demonstration gardens and flipped them to a production garden so they could provide more food to the community. As part of this, we instituted a robust program evaluation component so that we can learn from these 28 different projects about all the different models of urban agriculture that are out there and see how we can continue these efforts in the future. And this interest that we saw here in the United States is in focusing on urban agriculture and growing your own food as a result of the pandemic has been mirrored across the world. I know that people in cities from Uganda to London to Singapore are trying to grow their own food and get access to fresh, healthy produce in this difficult time. So I hope I've given you some ideas on how gardens and arboreta can engage on food security, whether in your local community or at a global level. I'd be very happy to continue the conversation with any of you who are interested in this area, and I'd like to really thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you tonight.
Thank you so much for us to think about and talk about, and challenges for collaboration and needs in the community, and then opportunities for the kind of work that botanical gardens historically have done and to continue into the future. Immediately, the most pressing challenge around the pandemic, of course, it's top on everyone's mind, and particularly this connection around food security. One thing that seemed to happen early on was a concern about that the entire food system was going to collapse, and some cries about that kind of haven't borne out. So in some ways, that's a good news story for our food system, and I'm curious what you're seeing from that perspective.
Yeah, I think we all saw, certainly here in the United States, there were some immediate supply chain disruptions. Certain sections of the supermarket where I couldn't get eggs for a few weeks, and
Right.
But I think that was sort of the immediate change, right? And then people figured it out and figured out how to send food that would have gone to restaurants to consumers instead, and so forth. And I know there was concern that there could be massive supply disruptions in the global food trade, and as you said, that hasn't really played out, and I think it's likely due to people taking a very concerted approach to making sure that didn't play out. But I think the bigger problem then is really the access at the local level. And it's not that the food isn't there, it's that so many people are not able to afford that food, or are not able to afford the foods that they normally would. And I think to some extent here, but especially in other parts of the world, the food that is most nutritious, the animal protein or the fruits and vegetables, can be the hardest to afford. And it's really people fall back on staple crops at times like this. And so that gets them the calories, but particularly for children, it doesn't get them the nutrition that they need.
You gave us a good challenge for collaboration. So the University of Guelph Arboretum was actually founded by the Ontario Agricultural College, the OAC, and had been part of a research station here before it was became an arboretum. Of course, University of Guelph is Canada's food university, and we have a number of partnerships and collaborations. And one of the things that I've heard as director is that there's often a lot of energy around starting a collaboration, and then maintaining it can be challenging. So I'm curious what you've seen in terms of successful long-term collaborations, and what are the kinds of elements or the partnerships that you've seen have that longer-term impacts.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's a question that isn't just about collaboration in the space of, say, crop wild relatives or botanic gardens and agriculture, but I think that's a challenge for collaborations in general. I think I think partners need to be invested in the outcomes, and so when you set up a collaboration, you need to make sure that both sides have something to gain from it, and have players that it's part of their role, it's part of their duties, and so I think from the garden perspective, ensuring that if I'm expecting us to be in collaborations in this space, then I need to make sure that the employees at the garden really feel that this is part of their job. It's not a side thing. But if we're really committed to conservation and we're really committed to these outcomes, then I'm making the time and the space for the people to participate. And I think the same would need to be true on the flip side if we're, say, partnering with the university, with researchers, with graduate students. We would be looking for partners for whom it's maybe a thesis project or a postdoc project, or it's something that they're really the outcomes are important to them. And then I just, looking back to sort of my previous work in doing a lot of international partnerships, I worked with a network of U.S. universities who were partnering with universities and research stations around the world. And so rather than if it was global or international work, I would say the most important thing is to have a local partner. So if you're looking to do some collecting work overseas, you're not just kind of parachuting in and getting your plants, but it's part of a collaboration with a local entity. And it can be a capacity building effort through that collaboration. You and the partner overseas can really learn something. And looking back to this example with U.S. universities, they partnered with these universities and entities in developing countries with shared objectives and goals over many years. And those kinds of partnerships were so fruitful. And the developing country partners gained so much from being a part of that partnership, and the U.S. universities learned so much from being able to really internationalize their operations. And looking now to collecting activities that we're involved with now, I think I've seen that be successful when there's a local partner on the ground, obviously, who knows where the plants are, who can best understand where to find them, and can take part in that ongoing partnership around collecting and conserving those plants.
Yeah, that partnership with local people and volunteers is something that we've seen here at the University of Guelph Arboretum. I've been looking at over 50 years, we've been sifting through the archives and various projects that staff and students and volunteers from the community have participated in, from plant sales to tree plantings, a whole range of things. It's been exciting to see those kinds of the importance of participation from a broad range of people to be engaged in projects and sustaining them. So some of the participants today are students and graduate students here at U of G, and I'd love to hear about some of your early forest canopy work. If you want to share kind of what that was about. Tell us about some of your tree background and tree history.
Sure. So yeah, I joined a graduate program. I was pretty young still, and it was one of those programs where you were expected to kind of show up and you had an advisor, but not an assigned project, and you really had to kind of come up with your own project and identify your own funding, which I know is not always the case in programs. And so I remember just kind of, the world is huge. There's millions of, I don't know how many hundreds of plants out there. They're all exciting and cool, and you had to kind of zero in on one. And I started focusing in on flowers, plants with large flowers, and water relations. I was in a plant physiology lab. And somehow, I'm not even quite sure how it happened, I zeroed in on the genus Adansonia, the baobab tree. And there, at the time, there's now one more. At the time, there were 8 species in the world, but 6 of those were in Madagascar. And so it seemed natural that if I wanted to study baobabs, I needed to go to Madagascar. And that sounded like a great idea. I remember my advisor had a moment where she's like, have you really thought about just what your life is going to look like if you're spending your entire graduate career in Madagascar out in the forest? And I was like, that sounds great, bring it on. And of course, there was a grain of truth to what she was asking me to consider, but it was fantastic. And so I shipped off to Madagascar with boxes and boxes of equipment. I was working at a small field station in Western Madagascar. Mostly Germans studying lemurs, and myself and one other American and a number of Malagasy researchers working with us. And just kind of had to figure it out from scratch. I didn't have my lab around me. I didn't have people with me. One person would go to town every week or two to download some emails onto a computer that we all shared. And but the chance to be out in the forest, and I had to kind of teach myself how to climb and get up in these baobab trees, and I was poking them and I was doing all sorts of horrible things to them, but really just trying to understand why they have the shape they are, why they're so fat, how they're so cool. Was a great experience, and it actually, I think, kind of in a way got me to where I am today, because I could see the forest destruction that was happening around us, and I could see the way that the tension between the Malagasy, who were small scale farmers, often slash and burn in these sort of dwindling natural areas. We would interact with them sometimes when students or those who were kind of foraging wide to study the lemurs would encounter poachers who were hungry families trying to find meat, and lemurs were those meat. And so just seeing those interactions, through a long circuitous path ended up, I think, to where I am today. But it's kind of what got me started on not just following the pure research mode that I'd been in earlier, but switching to more of a policy direction and ending up working in agriculture for 11 years or so before coming back to the garden world.
Yeah, that's great. I'm sure that's going to be really inspiring to a number of the students that are here and are participating in our programs.
Coming as I did straight out of the plant sciences, I didn't even know about the network of international agricultural research centers that are around the world, the CGIR, and I just always thought, like, wow, that would have been amazing if I could have done some sort of interaction with them earlier on in my career and gained that experience of working overseas in agriculture, having come out of the plant sciences world working overseas. It just seems like a really great way to kind of bridge the gap between they're doing a lot of work on germplasm and gene banks, and I don't think there's a lot of collaboration between the international ag centers and botanic gardens and arboreta. I think there's probably room for a lot more.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity. And in your role, you're on the board of the Botanic Garden Conservation International, right? Is there anything you can share about what's coming up in that space? Is this collaboration the kind of thing that organization is gonna be encouraging?
So I serve on the International Advisory Committee, which is a little different from the board. But to me, that felt like a great sort of bridge between my previous international work and now my role in the garden world, which, I'm very new to the garden world. I'm still very much learning it. I don't think I knew there was a Botanic Garden Conservation International before joining. And it's been really great to see that network and the role it plays in supporting gardens and arboreta around the world, particularly those in countries where they may not have the donor base or the resources from either government or from the community to really be a strong botanic garden, but so much excellent work being doing and so much support needed. And so it's been great to have that role of sort of understanding the international aspects of their work and seeing how we can help support BGCI to really be working in this space, whether it's assessments or whether it's they do small mini grants for gardens and arboreta around the world, but a really wonderful platform and a great network to connect with gardens and arboreta all over the place.
Yeah, that's great. And the University of Guelph Arboretum is a member of that organization. So when I emailed you to invite you, very excitedly saying that it was the University of Guelph's 50th anniversary. Thank you for your congratulations. Mm-hmm. You said, "Oh, it's our 200th anniversary. We've been and have also been celebrating." So I'm curious, what are some of the things that you did to celebrate the 200th anniversary? And are there any plants that are 200 years old that
So good question. Yeah. So yes, it's our 200th, the 200th anniversary of our congressional charter. A great and exciting year for us. Of course, our anniversary celebrations, much like yours, are looking very different than they would have otherwise. We opened an exhibit on our 200 years of history just a few weeks before we closed our conservatory to the public. So unfortunately, folks haven't gotten to kind of learn about it as much as we'd hoped. But we go way back to the founding of the United States. George Washington actually envisioned a public garden, a botanic garden in the nation's capital that would collect and display and educate people about plants that are of importance to our economy. Obviously, when George Washington was alive, the United States was really an agrarian economy, and plants were fundamental to that. And so he wanted there to be a place where we could bring plants from around the world and display them, and people could learn about how they play into our lives. And we've continued that mission to this day. Our mission is to educate people about the importance of plants. And, we've had many different iterations over the years, but that's been constant. And I think actually, as we start to think more about agriculture, it's been a really nice way of returning to our roots, even given that George Washington and other founding fathers, had farms and were engaged in agricultural activities. You asked about how many, if we had plants that are 200 years old, not quite, but not too long after we were established, the U.S. government sent out the U.S. exploring expedition around the world to collect plants, amongst other things. And that expedition did bring back a collection of living plants, and then those formed the basis for our current living collection. And we actually do have several plants in our collection that date back to those times, either the actual plant or a clone of the plant that came back on those ships. We have a vessel fern, a cycad, a couple cycads, and a ziziphus tree.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on. This spring in the pandemic, we also had to plant out a number of things that we've been growing in our greenhouse, actually, but we had less access to the greenhouse, and we planted some things out on the landscape, including a huge number of hemlocks, which with luck and care will last 600 years. It's a long-term prospect, working in an arboretum and in this space with plants. So thank you so much for your time. We look forward to following up with you. Did you have final thing you'd like to share?
Well, I think it's fantastic that you've reached 50 years, and I hope you'll be here for many, many more times, 50 years.
Thank you so much for that interesting and relevant talk, Saharah Moon. We are looking forward to celebrating, not in the way we had originally planned and hoped, but in our new way. We'll be celebrating all year online with social media. We have a website around Arboretum's history that we're going to be launching. We're going to be sharing photographs and stories, and also sharing talks about the relevant issues of our day. And the connection to food security and wild crop relatives is a great example of that kind of connection, partnership, opportunity that our Arboretum now, at 50 years old, has a clear role to play in. We have a couple of other pieces we're going to leave you with tonight. We're going to hear from Sean Fox, our manager of collections, about some of the conservation and collections work, the local leadership that Saharah Moon talked about that has been underway here at the Arboretum with the help of staff and faculty, students, community members, and volunteers, so many generous donors who have participated in various aspects of our conservation and collection efforts.
Botanic gardens and arboreta are known for their display of incredible plants from across the world. But one other important role they can play is the conservation of plants that are under threat. Here at the University of Guelph Arboretum, we formed the Rare Woody Plants of Ontario program back in 1978 to protect many of the woody plant species that need extra care, many species that people don't even know very well. And that includes things like you see behind me here in one of our gene banks, the cucumber tree, or Magnolia cuminata. This is Canada's first endangered tree, officially designated in 1984, and there are less than 300 known specimens in Ontario. We, at this point, have over 30 species of rare threatened woody plants in our Arboretum gene banks, We have visited various populations across the province, collected seed, grown them here, and now we have this very beautiful seed orchard under development that becomes very valuable for researchers and for restoration practitioners in the future. We have started collecting seeds from these seed orchards behind us, these cucumber trees. We sent them off to various research agencies that are doing studies on them, long-term seed storage, and this becomes very valuable for being able to ensure that these species can thrive in the future and be restored back in the landscape.
Our grounds and trails have remained open throughout the earliest days of the shutdowns for walk-through access only, and people have come to make that important connection to nature that we know is so important for mental health and well-being. We're going to leave you with a musical piece tonight that was recorded on the boardwalk earlier this summer for a festival called IF, Improvisation Festival, that was hosted here from the University of Guelph. I hope you enjoy it.